Welcome everybody to the Konflux Community Architecture Call. It's September 24th. I will put the agenda link into chat. Actually, Andrew already did it and pinned it. Thanks, Andrew. It looks like we have two topics today, and the first one is Mikola. Take it.
Yes, thank you. It's a very short topic. I would just like to let you know that build team is going to deprecate variations of buildah task, which we use in our pipelines that has resources customized. The reason for this is that we now have Tecton features that allows us to directly set resources from pipeline run, and there is no need for those tasks that we have in the past. So I attached a link to the doc which explains how exactly to configure your tasks. To use new mechanism, it's pretty simple. You just specify task name and specify step which you for which you would like to redefine resources, and just say, for example, that my buildah step should have 10 gigabytes of RAM and 5 CPUs, and tune it up to your needs in your namespace. So it's even better for end users because they are not limited to our tasks. But all users have to migrate to this new approach. I believe for now manually. So we are going to deprecate those tasks and we will assist users when needed. Build team.
I suppose it should be possible to identify who's using those tasks to be deprecated via Tecton results.
Yeah, that's possible, and we can contact teams or provide some other guides. Yeah, go.
I just wanted to check on what your process for deprecation was, what you're planning to do, how long you were going to give users to migrate.
Well, we are not rushing in this, so I believe like a month or two would be reasonable for this change. Thank you.
Yeah.
Next.
Yeah, thanks for working on it. It's a great progress for us to deprecate those tasks. It just makes me think if we need to reflect in our UI the quota the user has in his workspace, so they would know, like not to set requests that are higher than the amount of memory requests or CPUs that they can. Right now, we are not showing this information.
Yeah, that would be useful. At least it would keep users from doing such a mistake, and that wouldn't allow pipelines to run. Yes, good feature, I believe. Thank you.
Okay. So the next item on the agenda is future of workspaces. I want to give a little introduction to this one. So, workspaces are this construct that we have. We're essentially riding on top of Kubernetes namespaces with additional features layered inside of them. When we first started, they were provided by the what's now the CubeSaw operator, and as we've kind of made the journey to upstream and just looking at new features we want to adopt, we've had a workspaces team who's been working with the CubeSaw team to implement features, and we've been talking a lot about where this goes in the future. We currently have two competing visions for what we should do with this feature, right? So Gal and David have two different proposals that we want to consider. And I think we're going to have them present both of them here. We can get comments on them. Actually, we'll take, one of them has an ADR. Comments are being put there. David's is in a Google Doc. I think we need to make sure that that Google Doc is accessible to the community list, probably as we can make sure. So the way this works, I think this is the first time we really did this. So the way this works is that the community should try to make a decision about this in general, right? But if we end up deadlocked, the governing board, which is myself, Andrew, and Ralph, are tasked with making a decision that the community can't seem to make for itself. So first and preferred method is that we get all this information presented, everybody digests it, and community makes a decision, right? If that doesn't happen, we'll deal with that. So who's going first presenting? Do you guys care? Gal?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks for the
Great.
introduction. I can go first. I'll share my screen to show the ADR. Okay. So, of the context, Brian just talked about it. We have this construct of workspaces that we are carrying with us since we started with Konflux and its previous implementations. And I think it is about time to revisit this construct and to make sure that we really need it. And if not, just like stop using it. That's my point of view, and I'm explaining this idea why I think that we should stop to use this term and just like stick to Kubernetes namespaces. Just like as a background to say that Konflux community version that we launch in DevConf in June, it uses namespaces directly. It doesn't use any workspace abstraction. It doesn't have a workspace CRD or something like that, and it doesn't use kubesol. So, like as of today, that's what we have for Konflux community version. This is what you will get if you're using Konflux CI. It was due to time constraints. It was implemented like this, and to my opinion, it works great, and it's much more simpler than having another abstraction in the way. So Brian gave the introduction. Things that have changed since we started with Konflux. We want to make Konflux a successful open source project, and very important, we want it to fit in the cloud native applications ecosystem. So there is an ecosystem of applications that usually run on top of Kubernetes, integrate with the Kubernetes, extend it, and we want to be an application like those. And in my opinion, in order to be an application like those, you can't like live in a silo. You need to integrate with other successful applications. This is how you be part of the ecosystem and not like be an outsider. So you need to connect with other successful open source projects, integrate with them. I just said we had our first upstream release without kubesol, without the workspace abstraction. We made a decision, or maybe we're going to make it now, to not seek, like we made a decision not to use KCP. And also, let's say that we are now considering if we really need the transparent multi-cluster feature that like kubesol provides, and for that workspaces are used. So why do we need a workspace when using multi-cluster implementation? Because then it helps you understand where to route traffic, to which cluster. But if we are going to have, and this is what I recommend, to make Konflux by default deployable on a single cluster, then we don't really need a workspace. Please stop me at any time if you have questions. Okay, because I don't want to leave people with questions. And the last thing, something that related to Red Hat, we decided to stop. We decided not to try and implement a managed service which is based on Konflux. It means that some of the features required for running a managed service doesn't exist anymore. So it's not like you're going to register to someone else's service. Right now, like how we see it, or as I see it, the users of Konflux would be organizations. So there would be a platform, DevOps, SRE team that will run a Konflux instance for the organization. It means that like the way that users integrate with the system is a bit different. It's not like a managed service that is completely separated from the users. Like, I hope that I succeed to deliver the message that I have. It's like users and the operators of Konflux. My assumption is that they would be under the same organization, and this is why some of the features that are required for a managed service, we don't need them anymore. For example, waitlist. Okay, we don't need to let users register and give someone else the task to approve them. Questions about the first section? Okay. Yes. Yes.
You mentioned what we don't need with workspaces. I think that I think that it's more obvious what we don't need, but I think what isn't addressed in ADR is what we do get that is valuable from workspaces. In many places, you comment that some functionality of workspaces can be replaced with some other controller, with some other open source tool, and there isn't. I don't think that there is a sufficient categorization of what benefit we have, what functionality is critical in order to identify what tools would be needed to replace them to meet those same use cases, to determine what the replacement of a workspace would look like.
I must say that, like, for the tools that I'm suggesting to use are so there is like a mix of things in here. We have this workspace abstraction, and we have an implementation for that abstraction that we use today, just for the Red Hat deployments, which is kubso. And kubso provides a side of the multi-cluster routing. Beside of that, it provides an abstraction for creating the namespaces. So you can, for example, using RBAC, like decide, like, not directly using RBAC, decide who can create like workspaces. And this is something that you give this permission through kubso. And it lets you bootstrap the namespace with a set of resources. For example, resource quota, limit ranges. Those resources, it's a good thing to have them in the namespace, but they are not required to run Konflux. You can install Konflux on your cluster and create namespaces that will run Konflux pipelines, build, test, release, all of those, without having resource quotas or limit ranges in place. Okay? Now, if a user, like a Konflux operator, a person that runs Konflux, want to have those set of resources, or to have certain policy around how many namespaces can be created, what should be, who can delete namespaces, certain policy around it, there are existing tools that handle it. They're not specific to Konflux. There are policy engines, and there is like GitOps solutions that can do this job for us, and it brings two benefits. One, we don't need to implement it, so you just need to start using it. And two, which connects to what I said earlier, it puts us in the cloud native ecosystem. Like we can say we integrate, we work with those projects, we recommend to use them. Like places us with them on the same in the same place without trying to reinvent what they already do very successfully. Two of the Gatekeeper and Argo CD are graduated CNCF projects. Giverno has like 6,000 stars on GitHub. So I think it would be better for us to try to use what they offer instead of finding a replacement.
So
yeah.
Maybe the question is better for David. I suspect we don't need to get into the consequences of this decision right now, since we're just trying to understand both sides of the proposal for right now. But I mean, what I'm trying to understand is, like, we have acknowledged internally that we probably don't need multi-cluster because we have some Konflux instances that aren't multi-cluster. So not trying to, we shouldn't make the decision based on the feature set of kubectl. We should make the determination based on what is the core API that we realize value from the workspace, and then what would a replacement of that look like, and then what is the complexity of that replacement versus the complexity of the workspace abstraction.
Yeah, want me to chime in?
Sure.
Yep. Okay. Well, one thing I think we need to be careful is exactly what Andrew said. Is like some of these features, like waiting list, right? Multi-feature, multi-cluster, etc., does not really mean workspace abstraction. It means kubectl implementation of the workspace abstraction. And another thing I think we need to be careful just to differentiate, not, is like when we say, okay, can we integrate with successful projects in CNCF with a workspace abstraction in place? Absolutely. So the fact that we can integrate with successful projects like Argo CD, Giverno, Gatekeeper, OCM does not mean, should not be a point to make a decision on whether we have a workspace abstraction or not. I think the abstraction decision should be made solely on whether we want a consistent API and what value does it bring, and focus on the value that workspace abstraction brings. given the limitations that we have, and I could go through that when it's my turn, but there's clear limitations on namespaces. It was not meant to be self-service multi-tenant resource that you can manage yourself, right? It's meant to be like an admin creates a namespace for you, gives you a role binding, and off you go, right? So it's not like, oh, I'm gonna create my own namespace, and only that namespace is something that I can see, and only that namespace is something I can delete and update. No, right? So that's another thing that we need to include in this conversation.
Yes. So I want to refer to what you said. I suggest to deal with namespaces directly. So if I want to have a place to work, I can create a namespace and then create my applications and components, and it will work. In order to overcome the issues that you've mentioned, tools that I mentioned can be used. They can, for example, you can use Kyverno to assign a role binding of an admin to the user that created the namespace. So you can say, I'm fine with giving users creating namespaces on my cluster directly, because it's not different than giving them permission to create a workspace that later creates a namespace. Like, it's the same thing, right? If I can create a workspace and the result of it is a namespace created on the cluster, I can just create a namespace directly. The result would be the same. So the policy engine can be used for creating the role binding or applying quotas about how many namespaces can be created. It can enforce who can delete namespaces. It just like, you can think about it as a mechanism to extend Kubernetes RBAC. The thing is that I don't think that it is a Konflux specific problem. Kubernetes doesn't offer like those advanced features for namespaces. So I don't think that we should assume that users would need them. I think that users should keep using namespaces as they used to in Kubernetes, and Konflux should work with that. And if users want to have self-provisioning of namespaces or anything advanced, we can document how they can use existing projects, other projects, to achieve it.
All right. So, so you're saying the different projects to achieve it, and then we're going to set a reference implementation of those projects, right? But that implementation is not only the only implementation users can use, right? So they could use something else. They could implement their own thing if they want to, right?
Yes.
So the idea with the WordPress abstraction is to be inviting to be able to do that while keeping a consistent onboarding and offboarding into Konflux, right? So like the IDPs will give you authentication, but dealing with authorization, is that something we want to do or not, and make it easy and consistent no matter what the admin? And you keep saying ICANN, the user. We should distinguish between two types of users, right? The end user that's actually using the service, that's an admin provision for them, and an admin, right? So an end user having the same experience in kind, small cluster, having the same experience in a provision cluster that an admin provision for them, or having the same experience in a multi-cluster environment that someone devised for scalability, should be the same, is my opinion, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, multiple tools could be used for multi-cluster complex environment. Very simple tools can be used for a single local kind cluster, and maybe our tools, the ones that we do in our Red Hat deployments, could be like a reference implementation of that workspace abstraction, saying, hey, this is what we use ourselves, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. And then you're also inviting integration points. You're saying, hey, if you implement this interface, you can provision namespaces however you want. If you implement this interface, you can bootstrap a namespace however you want. And if you set up these properties, we'll make sure that the workspace has certain state, right? And then it's auto heal and things like that, right? But to me, having that consistent, especially if you start saying, "No, I'm going to use this tool, Argo, Kyverno, all that," and then someone just wants to try Konflux, then they have to install all these things, right?
No,
Or
no, not at all. Users, those are optional things. As I mentioned, a user can decide that he doesn't want to let users create namespaces, or he wants to let all the users create namespaces, and they can do it the way they want. Like, it's not a mandatory thing to have those tools for using Konflux, and a proof for that is Konflux CI that is usable today, used for Fedora as well, without those tools. Like,
yeah, I wanna make sure that the proposals are being understood before we get into a bunch of the debate. I mean, we can even debate offline, right? But like, Gal, like, I'm gonna give you like 5 more minutes,
yes,
so that we have equity of time, and so I want to make sure people really understand what Gal's proposing and ask any questions to clarify so that they understand what he's proposing.
yeah, okay, thank you. Thanks for focusing. My proposal is to use namespaces directly. A user wants to onboard, a user needs a namespace, he either creates it on its own, or the cluster administrator, whoever has permission for that cluster, will create the namespace for the user. Our UI will make API requests directly for creating namespaces, deleting namespaces directly to the Kubernetes API. The only one difference, the only API call that we can't make directly to the Kubernetes API is listing namespaces. And why is that? Because in Kubernetes, you either give permission to list all namespaces on the cluster, everything, including the system namespaces, or nothing. So this requires service that understand who is the user that is asking to list namespaces, and just lists the namespaces in the cluster and returns those that the user should see. And this is something that is already implemented today for Konflux community. This is how it works for the Konflux community version. This is bullet number 7. About how to give permissions to user, suggesting to use the built-in Kubernetes roles. So when installing Konflux, we will provide roles that will be aggregated to the view, edit, admin built-in roles of Kubernetes, and will give the appropriate permissions to our and to the Tecton CRDs. So, for example, if I, Gal, as the built-in view role and Konflux is installed on the cluster, I would be also will also have the ability to view application components, etc., on my namespace. Edit, I would be able to change them. Admin, I would be able to grant permissions to other people to be part of my namespace. Okay, we can play with it, but the idea is using the standard Kubernetes roles, built-in roles. The way to achieve public view access would be by the built-in system authenticated group that can be assigned to the namespace. So if I'm assigning to the namespace, so to the not to the namespace, but to the resources in the namespace, I'm assigning the permission to the system authenticated group, people that all the authenticated users can see it. Same as Kubernetes, so in Kubernetes, you don't have a resource that represents a user. You just issue a request with a JWT token, and if the cluster trusts the issuer of the token sees what is the name of the user and uses it for checking the permissions. So I suggest to stick with it and not have any CRD that represents a user. Remove the join the waitlist button, don't need it. And out of the box, when someone installs Konflux, we don't provide transparent multi-cluster deployment or capabilities. I'm not saying that it won't be possible, and we should leave the door open for implementations that would like to provide it, but I don't see it as a Konflux specific problem. I think a generic solution for multi-cluster tenancy should be explored because it's not Konflux specific. This is the changes that I want to have, and consequences and the benefits are listed here. Questions? Bottom line, sorry, someone wanted to say something? Bottom line, I want to make things simpler, to come closer to the Kubernetes API so we can make progress faster.
So that's available as an ADR in the upstream ADR repo. And so after this, as you digest it, you guys can go ask questions and put comments on the ADR. David, I'll give you the balance of the time.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. When we think of simplicity, we actually think about mainly the end user. You know, what would an end user experience look like? So just as a background, you know, it's pretty similar to what Gal mentioned, right? So the history, this was KCP, and then it became kubectl, which is the technology using developer sandbox. And we noticed like a few limitations, right? So there's no granularity for users to be able to use only their namespaces. So there's no consistent. The Kubernetes API does not provide that. So one thing that we realize is like having a layer in between that we can then implement that, you know, multi-tenancy within the same cluster has value by itself. Let's not even mention the fact that we can enable multi-cluster, that we can enable you know, integration with all the tools to be able to do the provisioning and bootstrapping of the namespaces, to manage you know, features like preventing things from getting accidentally deleted and things like that. So the architecture that we're proposing, and this is not only me, this is my whole team. Francesco's here and Andy's here, so they'll be able to answer questions as well. But the architecture we propose is basically having an intermediate resource. It's going to be a CRD called Workspaces with its own controller. All the user needs to do in order to sign up is just make sure it has the right access to the SSO or to the IDP in this case. And then once the IDP establishes trust with the cluster, like Gal said, then they can start making requests as unauthenticated users, unauthorized users, sorry. And then one of those requests could be, hey, the only thing they can do right now is create workspaces, right? We'll underneath, we'll handle what they can do with namespaces, what they cannot do with namespaces. We can bootstrap the namespaces depending on the backend, different ways. And we'll be able to set one important resource automatically, which is the role binding to the cluster role that we predefine, admin, viewer, the same thing Gal was talking about, right? So admin, viewer, participant, contributor, right? Just that role by itself, even if we're going to create quotas, even if we're going to create additional roles within the namespace specifically, that role binding by itself is already a good abstraction to have, that it would enable the user to self provision workspaces, right? So they just create a new resource. It comes down to the namespace, it provisions the namespace, and it creates that access so they can now start doing stuff on the namespace. And do stuff on the namespace could be like they can provision themselves the initialization resources, right? Or we can help them. So we have multiple options. So this is very simple from a user point of view. Now, an admin has a little bit more work because an admin needs to decide, okay, what backend I'm going to enable. And then everything that Gal mentioned about this is how upstream is working today, I'm encapsulating in this section here, which is the GitOps backend, right? So everything that we're doing upstream today could be integrated, could be an integration point with the workspace resource. Something else that we're suggesting is to do a very simple local implementation, which will enable people that are using Kind to have the same exact API and then have some sort of governance that looks exactly the same as it would in production. So that way, documentation is the same, the tooling is the same. If we have client integrations that we need to do, it'll be the same. Just connect to a workspace. And then obviously we have the kubeflow implementation, which we've been working on new features on kubeflow, and instead of working directly on making the changes on kubeflow, we opted out to start creating this layer. So this layer is already developed and it's being used in our Red Hat deployments. In fact, the UI team is collaborating with us to be able to start making requests to make changes to a workspace. The first change is going to be public viewer property. The second change is going to be they're going to be able to create multiple workspaces, and it's just a matter of creating a new workspace resource. So this is happening in the Red Hat deployments today. kubeflow has a way of doing things, like for example, the waiting list. It has a way to manage users. So it has a concept of a user resource, but that does not mean that the workspace abstraction needs to have the same. So in the case of the kubeflow implementation, they have that, right? In the case of local, we can implement it without that. And in case of GitOps, we can implement it without those, right? So, workspace abstraction is not really kubeflow abstraction, it's workspace abstraction. I want to make that clear, right? So I already described this, the backends, some of the features set. And as you can see, obviously, kubeflow is richer, but it supports things like proxying, which is advanced. It supports things like the user lifecycle, which we don't need to do in other backends. It does do multi-cluster, and it could do personal workspaces, which is something that comes default with kubeflow. The only thing that it cannot do is a vanilla KA. And that's something that is being planned for the future as well. So potentially we could also have kubeflow. Let's say kubeflow joins CNCF as a successful backend we can use, right? So we're leaving the door open there. For local, we're gonna delegate a few things. So the yellow ones mean we're gonna delegate. The red ones is like we think we don't need, especially for a given backend. So in the case of the local backend, we're not gonna support multi-cluster. Obviously, it's local, right? User authentication is delegated to the IDP, and user lifecycle is delegated to the IDP. And workspace sharing is just gonna be pure Kubernetes role binding creation, right? And we're not gonna support self-healing. We're not gonna support proxying. These are all things that will simplify this implementation tremendously and make it available for the main features, right? So obviously provisioning will be implemented, and public workspaces will be implemented with a combination of the IDP and KA, similar to what Gal said. It's just a matter of creating a role binding to the right user, authenticated users, right? Personal workspaces is something that we don't believe we should implement moving forward. It's a nice thing to have. Like, hey, you get a personal workspace by default, but it's not required. A user sign in, or you can just sign in to get invited to another workspace, similar to the way GitHub works, and similar to the way cloud providers work. Like, I'm gonna sign in, I get a user, but I don't necessarily have an account. I can get invited to an account, right? And then we don't need workspace idling. Workspace idling is a feature only from Kubeflow. We think it's nice to have also, but not required. This means, like, for example, if a user hasn't been active very much in its workspace, we can deprovision a few resources and save some energy and some compute, right? Some of the pros and cons, right? So the main thing at the top is consistent API. That's going to enable us to continue building the community. If you want something else to integrate with Konflux, it's nice to have a consistent API that those people can code against, regardless of how we do the namespace management, right? Able to represent namespace assigned to a user. This is one of the limitations that Gal mentioned, that he needed to do a special service for that. Well, that will be covered automatically here. User APIs are decoupled from Kubernetes concepts. This is what I mentioned. Is like, now we have the power to do more self-service and multi-tenancy without having to do special things. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of smart people here that can come up with special things. But from a user perspective, the user doesn't need to understand that. They just need to understand, okay, I'm going to create a workspace. And then the special things for the namespace management will be done under the covers. We can manage, not require, but we can automate the management of workspace quota enablement, and that could be synchronized. Like, if an admin sets up a set of quotas, templates, and these templates don't have to be OpenShift template, obviously. They could be Go templates, or they could be Helm charts, or they could be customized directory in some GitHub repository. So, but we can automate, once the creation of the namespace happens, if the admin decides these are the quotas I want to apply for my workspaces, perfect. That's what we're going to do, right? And then it's automated. The user has no idea that it needs to set up quotas or anything else, right? We're also able to add additional features. Like, for example, I was thinking workspace delete protection is something that comes to mind. We can also enforce limits on a specific workspace, because we can introduce the concept of ownership. This concept of ownership is not in namespace, so we need to somehow introduce it. So this is an easy way to say, hey, this workspace, this namespace is owned by this workspace, right? And then you can start saying, and this workspace is owned by this specific user. And that's the only person that can make things like delete or protection against delete or update, etc. We think that this is also an inviting proposition. Like, we can create a workspace layer with integration points and interfaces that can be implemented, and the community will feel like, hey, this is an inviting project. I get to implement my own things here. If I get stuck, if this doesn't cover my use cases, I can extend it, right? So it's kind of like, we think is an inviting proposition, right? The other thing that we were thinking with having this abstraction and having multiple backends is you can actually enable multiple backends at the same time, and enable attribute-based dynamic backend selection. For example, think about the future. You have multiple backends. One backend is like very sophisticated production, multi-cluster with high quality storage, and they can create high quality volumes with security embedded, integration with the secret manager. Hey, that backend could be enabled, and then it's based on the workspace attribute that you make the selection. Oh, this attribute means it's production, high priority, high risk. Let's use this backend, right? And that backend is very expensive. But if you're saying, hey, I just want a development workspace, we can use another cheaper backend. So it enables that situation where now you can, it's a proposition that customers also come and say, hey, this is something that I could run in production, right? And it's going to save me money. Able to validate duplicate workspaces. In this case, we were thinking, for example, if we do like a GitOps only without the abstraction, GitOps is perfectly happy saying, okay, I have 2 applications pointing to the same namespace, but different resources. Argo CD is pretty happy doing that. If we have an abstraction in place, we could say, no. The workspace by itself is unique. And then you won't have the situation where you have duplicate namespaces where then there's collision and we don't realize. So I'm sure there's other ways to solve collisions, but this is an easy way to solve collision. There's a CRD, there's a CR. You cannot have duplicates, right? We'll be able to migrate workspaces between backends. This is important because we already have that integration with kubeflow. So migrating to another backend like GitOps or local or anything else using, for example, OCM and Kyverno, we don't have to change Hack. Hack is already stressed. They have a lot of features to implement, and then we can say, hey, for these features, you only need to interact with the workspaces. You don't need to worry about how workspaces implement that. So go ahead and code everything against this API, right, ahead of time, because we have some reference implementations and you can test it. Some of these disadvantages, and there could be more. These are the ones that are obvious to us and we're a little biased. So please feel free to suggest all the disadvantages here. But the only disadvantage I see is the development time, which we mitigated already because we already developed 80% of the things that need to be developed. And obviously, maintenance of another controller. You need to maintain things like observability, metrics. So you need to have an extra set of maintenance features for that, right? So that's something that's a disadvantage. But on our side, we think that the benefits outweigh the disadvantage. I mean, again, we're biased, but that's my idea, right? So keep it simple for the end user, make it flexible for the admin, make it flexible for the community to extend. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question, and I'm just trying to understand the proposals a little bit more. But how much does Konflux need to know about CubeSaw? I guess it's the core of my question, because I'm looking at the proposal that y'all provided, right? And if I'm understanding, it's basically let's offload, the creation of namespaces and all that to something else, something that already exists, or maybe an external community project. And is CubeSaw essentially another one of those options?
Exactly.
Or is using CubeSaw, does Konflux need to, do things need to be tied to that specific choice for those operations?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So today, half and half. Like, for example, Hack, we already work with Hack to talk to us when making changes to workspaces and to create new workspaces. It's already designed to be able to create new workspaces without having to, like one of the things we have today in our internal clusters is like, and a request needs to be made to create a workspace. We have to follow an SOP. None of that. This will be all self-service, right? But to answer your question, half of the other stuff, Hack is still aware of CubeSaw. So that's why I say 80%, not 20, not 100, right? And Hack needs to understand what, for example, a space binding request is, right? Or they need to understand what a space is. And they need to understand where the user sign up is. And all that can go away if then our workspace abstraction have other implementations of that don't require that. So the fact that CubeSaw requires that makes then the workspace require that. But if the workspace does not have that kubesaw as a backend, then if they, if you can envision like a normal controller that provisions namespaces and manages authority and bootstrapping locally, that's a pretty simple controller, right? So that controller doesn't have a lot of the features that kubesaw has, but it misses purpose if you want to install it in kind, right? So to answer your question, our goal is to get Hack and the CLI completely agnostic to kubesaw. So then we can then say, okay, it's completely isolated. That's the work we're doing today downstream in our Red Hat deployments. Once it's completely isolated, then now we can say, hey, okay, all the backends will come in. And that's why I say it's good to have that in the community so that we can enable any migrations if we decide some of our deployments in Red Hat not to use kubesaw, right? It'll be easy if we have this set up. Does that answer your question? Sorry. Let me give you a chance to chime in.
Yeah, I think I have a better understanding now. Thank you.
Okay. And kubesaw, guys, I don't want to kubesaw has an opportunity to become a CNCF thing. So, they don't have the bandwidth now, but they could have the bandwidth next year. And they could spend the time and then make it a, state-of-the-art namespace as a service tool, right? And then it's there. We already have some integration with it, and it could be used if a community. So we're enabling the community to make a choice, but we have an integration point, so the user doesn't have to suffer the choices, right? The end user.
David, I just want to comment to what Luis asked and clarify something about my ADR. Creating workspaces, deleting workspace, my suggestion, do it directly through the Kubernetes API without anything in between. But provisioning like a default set of resources, such as a role binding for the admin, resource quotas, and all of those, we will defer this responsibility to a third-party tool.
Right.
But in my proposal, there is no abstraction. You want a namespace, you create a namespace. You don't create a workspace and then something creates the namespace for it.
Okay, you keep saying create a namespace, but creating a namespace is not something that the user will be able to do directly.
So
you got to use those tools that you mentioned to create the namespace.
No, it's not correct. You can give users permissions to create namespaces.
Do you want to go there? You want to
How is it different from letting the user create workspaces and then a namespace is created? It's the same thing.
No, it's different. The workspace is a different resource.
Yes, but eventually a namespace is created. It's just like going around, but you get the same result. If I want 10 names, if I want a namespace, I will just create a workspace and I will get a namespace. So
you said that I think we're arguing semantics. You say, okay, I can create the namespace manually, and then somehow you need to come up with a solution to restrict who can create names. How many namespaces you somehow have to restrict. Once you create it, you only can access that, right? And then you delegate it. Hold on, let me finish. And then you delegating that to another tool, which is to me an abstraction, to do the bootstrapping and creating the role binding and doing all the necessary things. So this is a usable namespace. Creating a namespace by itself is not going to do it, right? So my proposal is just saying, hey, yes, that is one way to do it. But if the user only worries about creating a workspace, we can handle that with third-party tools or not. So the fact that you can use third-party tools does not mean that this proposal is invalid, right? It just means that, okay, so the user does not have to worry about creating the namespace directly. He just worries about creating the workspace, and we handle the rest of the things that need to happen for that namespace to be a namespace that Konflux can use, right? So that's the difference. So you still need to do tools to make sure that namespace is something that Konflux can use. I'm just saying, well, don't do it. Just do workspace and then let the workspace controller worry about the tools and the admin.
I have a couple questions from a not as technical as some of you user. At the moment, I know that when we create workspaces, they inherit, they have a quota applied on them by KubeSoft. Is it possible to set a default quota
Yes.
with the native namespace option, Gal? Like such that when a user creates a namespace directly through the Kubernetes API that already has a quota, a clustered like default quota?
It will require using an additional tool. Today I know about two that can do it. One is Kyverno, and the other one is Argo CD. There is no option in Kubernetes to create a namespace and then to get a this I didn't found, maybe someone else knows. There is no option to create a namespace and then by default it gets a certain quota. And for that, an additional tool would be needed.
Or an extension to Kubernetes. That's what extensions are for. Provide things that are not in Kubernetes proper, you know?
Yeah.
So
Those Argo CD, Kyverno are extensions to Kubernetes. Those just happen to be extensions that we don't develop, and they already widely adopted.
With the Argo CD method, I don't understand that one. I can imagine creating namespaces in a Git repo, and then those are being applied with a quota. But like, if I'm just using the API, is it watching for new namespaces and then reacting to it like a controller?
Using it, yes. So I've tried it. You can using an extension to application set controller. So application set controller lets you provide a plugin, and then you can say every time there is a new namespace, create an Argo CD application for it, and deploy that those manifest to that namespace. So this is how you can achieve it using Argo CD. And Kyverno has like a built-in feature that you can say, when there is a new namespace, create this list of resources. And you define it in its CRD, which resources you want to create in new namespaces. One of them can be the role binding for the user that created the namespace.
yeah.
We're out of time.
We're out of time.
I want to take Andrew. You want to be quick?
No, my question's probably not going to be quick.
Okay, guys, feel free to comment on the ADR. David, you're going to maybe put yours into ADR.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's put it in ADR.
I think there's some tricks where you can export your document directly to Markdown, which will help you get it done quickly.
No problem. I can definitely take that task.
In addition, feel free to start discussions or ask specific questions on the mailing list, the Konflux CI Google Group mailing list.
Okay.
Like, this would be a good place until the other ADR is there. Thanks everybody for coming. I will post the recording as soon as it's available, and hopefully we will close on this in the next couple weeks.
All right. Thank you for the time. Bye guys.
Bye, guys.
Take care.